This difference in therapeutic outcome between isolated compounds from cannabis and the use of herbal cannabis or broad-spectrum or full-spectrum cannabis extracts is attributed to something often called the entourage effect.
I think the best depiction of this idea of the entourage effect, or what we have called for probably longer synergy in medicinal plants, is a symphonic effect.
That's Kevin Spelman, a molecular biologist and phytochemist that's dedicated his entire professional career to trying to understand why plants affect the body the way they do. And lately, he's had his eyes on cannabis.
So think about a Mozart symphony that's so incredibly beautiful. And you have a lead violin, and then you have all these other instruments, right? And all those other instruments basically support that lead violin. Now, what's happened in pharmacology is, under the illusion, and I will call it an illusion, that we can control the dose, we've isolated the lead violin and just use that in our pharmacology. And the rationalization for this is actually, if you really go back and look at the science, the rationalization for doing this is actually not very strong scientifically. In the 30s, in the early 20th century, 20s, you had the eclectic physicians doing studies on whole plant extracts, and then in some cases they actually used an isolated constituent. And this is the Lloyd brothers. The eclectic physicians were supported by some brilliant pharmacists called the Lloyd brothers. And the Lloyd brothers were really good at extracting. In fact, some of their instrumentation, their chemical instruments are still used today. They invented them to do extractions, and we still use them today in chemistry labs. So they had this opportunity to look at whole plant extracts versus isolated constituents. And they found in many cases, not always, but they found in many cases that the whole plant extracts were had a better outcome. Now, and I think that's really what we have to look at, because in an isolated model, for example, a cell culture in an animal model, you actually might get a better outcome with an isolated constituent.
Right.
Because you're pounding, essentially it's pharmacological dosing versus physiological dosing, right? So in physiological dosing being that idea of using just enough to get the effect you're looking for.
Minimum effective dose.
Exactly. And what we end up seeing with this in healthcare is that everybody's too busy to do that. The patient's too busy to pay attention, because they're going to have to pay attention to where they get the effect. The doctor's too busy to actually put an inquiry into where was that dose that worked for you. And everybody wants instant relief. So it's fallen by the wayside. But were we to pursue that further, I think we'd have a much more effective model. The other thing that happens here when we look at isolates versus whole plant extracts is the adverse event profile goes up. And this is a huge issue. And for example, in my own body, if I take ginkgo 24/6, the standardized stuff, I actually end up with a huge diuretic effect. I'm running to the bathroom every 20 minutes. If I just use ginkgo leaf that's thrown in a capsule, I don't have that effect.
Yeah.
I notice the blood flow effect in terms of cognitive function with both of them, but I'd rather use the whole leaf ground up. So we have that lead violin that's working. And what we found in reductionist chemistry now is that, there's more than one lead violin. Turns out that the oboe takes a lead in this section as well.
Yeah.
Right? And it turns out that the cello also ends up having a lead so we have found multiple active constituents. In the case of echinacea, it's been hypothesized that at least four now compounds are considered the actives. When they came across the CB2 binding of alkylamides, what happened is everybody thought, we've finally done it. We have found the active in echinacea. Well, not so fast, because we've got the caffeic acid derivatives, which, by the way, are directly antiviral, but incredible antioxidants and potentially block histamine release. By the way, if you're looking at anaphylactic reactions and you're stuck in a pinch. We've also got the polysaccharides, the rabinogalactans in echinacea that are also super active and directly stimulate immune function. So that becomes very interesting, because here in one plant you've got something that's a bit of a dampening effect, the alkylamides, and you've also got something that's a direct immune stimulator, that's arabinogalactines, and then you've got something that tends to modulate immune function, that's a caffeic acid derivative. Oh, and by the way, it's antiviral. So we can't simplify plants to one constituent, and that's the mistake that's being made over and over and over. It started in the 70s with ginseng. People were looking at ginseng and saying, "Oh, what's the active constituent?" And they came upon the ginsenosides, or the saponins of the plant. And so what happened from this ridiculous research in the 70s is there was a time when people would look at plants, and if they didn't have alkaloids or they didn't have saponins, they were thrown out. No, they're not active.
Yeah.
It's all fantasy. No, these tribes using this are not getting any effect. We know best.
Right. We've studied it.
Exactly. So I could talk about this all day. I've written a couple of chapters on it in books, and published a couple of papers on synergy. But the idea that there's only one active compound is really naive. There is this bias in science against medicinal plants as if it's not real. And we need to stop and realize that about half of all of our drugs have been based on medicinal plants, and about 25% of all of our pharmacopoeia is still directly isolated from medicinal plants. If you look at cancer drugs, something like 70% of them in the last 10 years have come from natural products in some sort of way. So when physicians and healthcare providers look at me as, with a disapproving look that I'm into medicinal plants, they don't understand their own pharmacopoeia that they're writing from daily.